There are humiliations that happen loudly, and everyone looks away. This was the quiet kind. The kind where a father hands his daughter a small death and calls it seating arrangements. Cecily Voss had dressed carefully that evening. Not extravagantly, her family could no longer afford extravagant, but carefully. The pale gray silk was pressed, her gloves were clean, her hair was pinned without a single strand out of place. She had done everything right. She always did everything right. It had never once mattered. The Ashford dining room seated 40. Long candles, long table, long list of names arranged by rank, by fortune, by consequence. Cecily had scanned the seating chart in the entrance hall the way one scans for one's name in a list of survivors. She found it. Table B. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. She didn't understand at first. She looked again. Then she followed the small hand-lettered sign past the great table, past the lesser table, to the far corner of the room near the tall window, where 4 children between the ages of 6 and 11 were already seated, swinging their legs, arguing over the bread rolls. Cecily stood very still for a moment. Then she smoothed her skirt, walked to the corner and sat down. Her father, Lord Voss, was already at the main table, laughing, leaning toward the Duchess with the easy confidence of a man who had nothing to be ashamed of. He did not look up. He did not look across the room. He did not look at her once. At the head of the great table, Duke Edmund Ashford lifted his wine glass and did not drink. He watched. The girl to Cecily's left was 8 years old and missing a front tooth. Her name was Arabella, and she introduced herself with complete seriousness, before immediately asking whether Cecily was being punished. Cecily looked at her. At the small, earnest face, the ink stain on one white glove, the bread roll already half destroyed in her fist. "Aren't we all darling?" Cecily said. Arabella considered this deeply and then nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to the bread. Cecily folded her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead. She had known, in a vague and unexamined way, that this evening was important to her father. He had told her to wear something suitable. He had told her to be pleasant. He had told her twice that the Duke of Ashford was unmarried and that his estate bordered theirs, and that these things had a way of resolving themselves if a woman was sensible enough not to ruin them. She had thought he meant to introduce her. She understood now that he had meant something else entirely. The Ashford fortune was old and intact. The Voss fortune was neither. Lord Voss had been managing, which was to say, borrowing, for the better part of a decade, and the walls of their estate were beginning to show it in ways that guests were too polite to mention. Cecily had been managing the household accounts since she was 19. She knew the numbers. She knew what they meant. She had simply not known that her father had begun to think of her as one of them, a number, an asset, a resolution. The children's table had 3 courses. The soup was good. Cecily ate it. Across the room, the adults moved through their dinner with the practiced ease of people who had never once been made to feel small in a room full of people who were pretending not to notice. The Duchess of Ashford, a tall, precise woman with silver hair and the expression of someone perpetually correcting an error, held court at the far end. Lord Voss was beside her, still laughing, still not looking. Cecily cut her lamb into even pieces. "You're very quiet," said the boy across from her. He was perhaps 10, with his father's cravat and his mother's suspicion. "Yes," said Cecily. "Arabella talks too much," he added. "I do not," said Arabella. "Most interesting people do," said Cecily. She looked at Arabella. "Don't let him convince you otherwise." Arabella beamed. The boy looked uncertain. Cecily returned to her lamb. She did not cry. She had decided, somewhere between the entrance hall and this corner of the room, that she would not give the evening that. Whatever her father had arranged, whatever the Duchess had designed, whatever quiet understanding had placed her here, it would not have her tears. It could have her presence. It could not have anything else. The candles burned lower. The main table grew louder. Someone made a toast, and Crystal rang out across the room in that bright, satisfied way that Crystal does when everything is going well for the people holding it. Cecily watched the flame in front of her. She did not notice until Arabella tugged her sleeve that the room had gone slightly quieter. She looked up. Duke Edmund Ashford was crossing the dining room. He was not heading toward the door. He was not heading toward his mother, or the wine, or any of the dozen small social obligations that fill the movements of a man in his own house at his own dinner. He was walking with the unhurried, deliberate step of someone who had made a decision and was no longer interested in reconsidering it. He stopped at the children's table. He looked at the empty chair beside Cecily, the one that had been left empty because there were only 4 children and 5 chairs, and he pulled it out, and he sat down. The room did not gasp. Rooms like this never gasped, but the silence that moved through it was the social equivalent: a held breath, a redirected gaze, a sudden intense interest in one's wine glass from 40 people who were absolutely, certainly, not watching. The Duchess of Ashford had gone the color of old paper. Lord Voss had finally, for the first time all evening, looked up. Edmund settled into the small chair with the calm of a man entirely unbothered by the fact that his knees did not fit comfortably beneath the table. He nodded once at Arabella, who stared at him with her mouth open. He nodded at the boy, who sat up very straight. Then he turned to Cecily. She had not moved. She had not looked at him. She was looking at the candle. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was low, not warm exactly, but not cold either. Considered, she would think later, like a man who chose every word and wasted none. She turned her head. Up close, the Duke of Ashford was not what the drawing rooms had advertised. They had called him severe, handsome in an uncomfortable way, the sort of man who made people want to agree with him before he had finished speaking. All of that was true, but there was something else in his face at close range that she hadn't expected. He was angry. Not at her, not the explosive, visible anger of men who needed to be seen. Something quieter, something that had been sitting in him all evening, watching, and had finally decided it was finished watching. "I believe introductions are overdue," he said. Cecily looked at him for a long moment. "They are, Your Grace," she said, "though I wonder why it took until the 3rd course." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, something that might have become one under different circumstances. "I was deciding," he said. "And have you?" He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "I have. Lord Voss called it a great honor." He said this the following morning at breakfast, in the bright, slightly too loud voice he used when he was covering something. The Duke of Ashford had expressed an interest in calling, formally, which meant, Lord Voss explained, setting down his coffee cup with a small, satisfied click, that the evening had gone exactly as intended. Cecily looked at her father across the breakfast table. He had the grace, at least, to look briefly away. "We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel." She said nothing. She had learned over many years and many breakfasts that silence was the only language her father could not interrupt. Edmund called on a Tuesday. He sat in the Voss drawing room with its faded curtains and its careful arrangement of the furniture that was still worth keeping, and he drank his tea without remarking on any of it. Lord Voss hovered for the first quarter hour with the barely contained energy of a man watching an investment mature, then excused himself with transparent diplomacy and closed the door behind him. Cecily and Edmund sat in the quiet room. Outside, a gardener was doing something involving gravel. A clock ticked. The curtains moved in a draft from the window that had never properly sealed. "You didn't write," Cecily said. Edmund looked at her. "No." "After the dinner, I half expected," she stopped. She hadn't expected anything. She had told herself very firmly that she hadn't expected anything. It doesn't matter. It does, he said. I didn't write because I wasn't sure what I wanted to say. I don't tend to speak before I'm sure. And now you're sure, he set his tea down. I'm here. Cecily studied him. He was doing it again, that thing where he gave her just enough to lean toward and not quite enough to hold. She had spent one evening in his company and she already recognized it, which annoyed her more than the thing itself. Your Grace, she said, I think we should be honest with each other. I would prefer nothing else. You sat at a children's table in front of 40 people. That means something in rooms like yours. I'm not naive enough to pretend it doesn't. She folded her hands in her lap, the same way she had at his dinner in that corner with the candles. But I also know what my father's finances look like, and I suspect you do too. So before we proceed with whatever this is, I'd like to know which of those things brought you here. The room was very quiet. Edmund looked at her for a long moment, not the way men usually looked at her, through her, past her, towards some calculation she was meant to represent. He looked at her the way she had looked at the seating chart, carefully, like the answer mattered. Both, he said, and neither. She waited. I knew about your father's debts before the dinner, he said. My solicitor informed me. It's why he was invited. Your father is not subtle, Miss Voss, and neither are his intentions. A pause. I had no particular interest in the arrangement. And yet you sat in that corner without a word of complaint, spoke kindly to a child who asked if you were being punished, and ate 3 courses in the most dignified silence I have ever witnessed. Something moved through his expression, brief, unguarded, gone almost before it arrived. I found I had quite a lot to say after that. I simply needed to decide how. Cecily said nothing for a moment. Then she said, That is either the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years, or you are very, very good at this. I've been told both, said Edmund. And there it was, not quite a smile on her side either, but the shape of one, the possibility of one. He came back on Thursday. And the following Tuesday. And once, unexpectedly, on a Friday afternoon when Cecily was in the back garden, attempting to do something productive about the roses that had been left entirely to their own ambitions. She was not wearing her good gloves. There was a smear of dirt on her left sleeve. She looked up and found him standing at the garden gate with an expression she couldn't read. You didn't send word, she said. No, he agreed. I look terrible. You look, he said, and then paused and then said, occupied, in the tone of a man who had reconsidered his first word. She let him in. They walked the garden for an hour. He knew more about roses than she had expected his mother's doing, he said briefly, in a way that closed the subject. She showed him the ones that had survived the winter. He listened the way he did everything, completely, without interruption, with that quality of attention that made a person feel that what they were saying was the only thing in the world worth hearing. It was, she was beginning to understand, a dangerous quality. The Duchess of Ashford sent for her on a Wednesday. No explanation. A card, formally worded, delivered by a footman who clearly wished he were somewhere else. Cecily read it twice, then folded it, then went. The Duchess received her in a room that was almost aggressively elegant, every surface a statement, every object chosen to remind a visitor of exactly where they stood in relation to the woman who owned it. She gestured to a chair. Cecily sat. You are not what I would have chosen, the Duchess said. Cecily waited. My son has a great deal of freedom that I allowed him when he should not have. He is stubborn. He always has been. She looked at Cecily the way a jeweler looks at something brought in by a stranger, assessing, unimpressed, not yet decided. He will not be advised on this. I know that. I am not attempting to advise him. Then what are you attempting, Your Grace? The Duchess's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, with something more like recalibration. I am telling you, she said, that my son is the Duke of Ashford, His wife will be discussed, examined, and judged by every drawing room in London before the ink on the announcement is dry. Whatever he believes about the irrelevance of background and fortune, the world does not share his belief. You would enter a life that would not be easy. A pause. I want to know if you understand that. I've been seated at the children's table, Your Grace, Cecily said. I understand rooms that don't want me in them. The silence that followed was long. Then the Duchess said very quietly, Yes, I imagine you do. She stood. The interview apparently was over. Cecily rose, smoothed her skirt, and moved toward the door. Miss Voss, she stopped. I arranged that seating chart, the Duchess said. I want you to know that you know, and that I have not in 40 years of arranging things been more soundly answered. Cecily turned. The Duchess was looking out the window. Her back straight, her hands folded, her voice entirely controlled. Good afternoon, she said. Cecily left. The letter was waiting for her when she returned home, not from Edmund, from her father. She read it standing in the hallway, still in her coat. It was brief, businesslike. The kind of letter Lord Voss wrote when he had already made a decision and was informing rather than consulting. He had accepted an offer on her behalf, not from the Duke of Ashford. From a Baron Feltham of Yorkshire, widowed, 53 years old, considerable property. The wedding, Lord Voss had written, was anticipated for the following month. The arrangement is advantageous and I expect your compliance. Cecily read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease, walked to the writing desk in the parlor, sat down and picked up her pen. She wrote one letter, to Edmund. It took her 4 attempts to say what she needed to say in a way that was honest without being desperate, clear without being cold. In the end, she wrote only 3 sentences. I know what my father offered you. I know now that you declined it. My answer to Baron Feltham is also no, but I find I cannot send it without telling you first. I don't entirely know why. She sealed it before she could reconsider. She gave it to the housekeeper to post. Then she went upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed, and stared at the wall for a long time. Edmund read the letter in his study, standing still in his riding coat. His secretary had placed it on top of the morning's correspondence. He had opened it first without knowing why. He read it once, then again. He set it down on the desk. He stood very still for a moment. The kind of stillness that isn't the absence of movement, but the presence of a decision being made beneath the surface, somewhere deep and quiet and final. Then he looked at his secretary, who was studying a spot on the wall with great interest. Send nothing back, Edmund said. The secretary blinked. Your Grace. Not yet. He picked up the letter again, held it. But clear my diary for next week. The announcement appeared in the society pages on a Thursday morning. Lord Voss is pleased to announce the forthcoming marriage of his daughter, Miss Cecily Voss, to Baron Feltham of Yorkshire. The ceremony is anticipated for the 14th of next month at St. Margaret's Church. Cecily read it over her breakfast coffee. She had not been consulted about the wording. She had not been consulted about St. Margaret's. She had, in the technical sense, not been consulted about any of it, the 14th, the church, the precise phrasing of pleased to announce, as though her father's pleasure were the central fact of the matter. She set the paper down. She drank her coffee. She did not send the letter to Baron Feltham. Not yet. She told herself it was because she was still composing the wording. She told herself it required careful handling. She told herself a great many things over the following days in the quiet of her room while the household began the preparations that households begin when a daughter is about to be resolved. Edmund did not write. A week passed, then another. The dressmaker came. Cecily stood very still while measurements were taken and fabrics were discussed in the bright, busy language of women who believed they were doing something happy. Her father moved through the house with the relieved energy of a man whose accounts were about to balance. He was kind to her, in that particular way he had when he needed something to go smoothly, attentive, present, almost warm. Cecily let him be kind. It cost her nothing, and it cost him a great deal, she suspected, though he didn't know it yet. Edmund did not write. She stopped expecting him to on a Tuesday, which was the same day she accepted with a flat and practical clarity that she had misread everything. The garden, the tea, the way he listened, the letter she had sent, I don't entirely know why, which she now replayed in the privacy of her own mind with the particular horror of a woman who had said too much to a man who had apparently decided too little. She was, she told herself, not heartbroken. She was embarrassed. There was a difference. She wrote to Baron Feltham on Wednesday. The response came on Friday, not from Baron Feltham, from Edmund's solicitor. It was a formal document, dense with legal language, and it took Cecily 3 readings to understand what she was looking at. When she did understand, she sat very still for a long moment. Then she went to find her father. Lord Voss was in his study, which was not unusual. He was the color of old ash, which was. "You knew," she said. He didn't pretend not to understand. That at least she would give him. "It was a business arrangement," he said. "The estate. You offered me to the Duke of Ashford as settlement for your debts." She kept her voice very even. She had learned this from him, ironically, the even voice, the controlled surface, the way you could say devastating things in a perfectly ordinary tone. He declined, so you found someone who wouldn't. Feltham is a respectable. How much, she said, he told her. She looked at her father, at this man who had sat laughing at a duke's dinner while his daughter ate with the children, who had written "I expect your compliance" in the same hand that had once written her name in a family Bible, who had looked at her and seen, for as long as she could remember, a number in a column that wouldn't quite balance. "I see," she said. She left the study. She went upstairs. She sat at her writing desk and she did not write anything for a long time. The week before the wedding, Edmund disappeared. This was not unusual for men of his position. They disappeared into their estates, their clubs, their various obligations. But his secretary had cleared his diary. His mother, when asked, said nothing useful. His carriage had not been seen in London for 10 days. Cecily heard this from Arabella's mother. Of all people, a pleasant woman named Mrs. Holt, who had sought Cecily out at a small afternoon gathering with the guilty energy of someone who felt partially responsible for an outcome they hadn't quite intended. "I'm sure it means nothing," Mrs. Holt said, in the tone of a woman who was sure it meant something. "I'm sure you're right," said Cecily. She drank her tea. She smiled at the right moments. She said the things that were said in rooms like this by women in her position, gracious, pleasant, unremarkable things that gave nothing away and asked for nothing back. She was very good at it by now. She had been practicing her whole life. The morning of the 14th was gray. Not dramatically gray, not the gray of storms and portents, which would at least have had the decency to match the occasion. Just the ordinary gray of an English morning that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to do. Cecily stood at her bedroom window in her dressing gown and looked at it for a while. Her maid came in at 7:30. The dress was ready. The flowers had arrived. Everything was proceeding exactly as things proceeded when they were going to happen, whether you wanted them to or not. Cecily sat at the dressing table. She watched herself in the mirror, the careful, familiar face of a woman who had spent a great many years making sure nothing showed, and she thought, with a sudden and startling clarity, that she was very, very tired of it. Not of Edmund, not even of her father particularly. Of smallness. Of being arranged and managed and seated and sold by degrees so gradual that each individual step had seemed almost survivable. Until here she was on a gray morning in a wedding dress being fitted for a life she had not chosen. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that sat in her chest like a cold stone, was how unsurprised she was. She had always known it would come to this. She had simply, briefly, stupidly, thought it might not. Her maid was pinning the veil when the knock came. Not at the front door. At the servants' entrance, quiet, unhurried, the knock of someone who didn't need to announce themselves but was choosing to anyway. The housekeeper appeared in the doorway a few minutes later with an expression Cecily had never seen on her before. She was holding a small box. "This came for you, miss," she said. Just now, Cecily looked at it. It was a plain wooden box, small enough to hold in one hand with no wrapping and no note. She opened it. Inside, nestled in a fold of dark cloth, was a small silver cup, a child's cup, the one from the corner table at the Ashford dinner. Cecily stared at it. Her maid had stopped pinning. The housekeeper had not moved. The gray morning sat in the window, still undecided. Cecily lifted the cup, turned it over. On the base, in very small letters that hadn't been there before, something had been engraved. "I kept it. I shouldn't have, but I did." She was still holding it when the second knock came, this one at the front door. She heard her father's voice in the entrance hall below, surprised, uncertain, climbing towards something that wasn't quite alarm but was approaching it. Then another voice, lower, that she knew with a certainty that settled in her bones before her mind had quite caught up. She stood. She set the cup carefully on the dressing table. She walked out of the bedroom, down the hall, and to the top of the stairs. Edmund was standing in the entrance hall below. He had not dressed for a wedding, not his own, not anyone else's. He was in his riding coat, his hair slightly disordered from the road, and he was looking up at her with an expression that was not quite the controlled, considered face she had catalogued across a dozen quiet afternoons. He looked, she thought, exactly like a man who had made a decision. Her father was beside him, cycling rapidly through emotions. "Cecily," Lord Voss said, in the voice he used when he needed her to be sensible, "the Duke has arrived unexpectedly, and I think it would be best if—" "Lord Voss," Edmund said, without looking at him, his eyes still on Cecily at the top of the stairs. "I'd like to speak with your daughter." "The wedding is in 2 hours." "Yes," said Edmund. "I know." A pause. "That's rather why I'm here." Lord Voss opened his mouth. Edmund turned to look at him then, just looked, quietly, with the full weight of a man who owned half the county, and had not slept in 2 days riding through the night to stand in this entrance hall, and Lord Voss closed his mouth. Cecily came down the stairs. She stopped 2 steps from the bottom, which put her nearly at eye level with him. She looked at his face, the tiredness in it, the road dust on his coat, the thing in his expression that was neither the anger she'd seen at his dinner table nor the careful control of his drawing-room visits, but something rower and more honest than either. "You didn't write," she said. "No. For 3 weeks." "I know." "I thought—" She stopped. She had promised herself she would not tell him what she had thought. She looked at him for a moment. Then she decided she was tired of not saying things. "I thought I'd been a fool." "You weren't," he said. "I was handling something. It took longer than it should have." "What were you handling?" He reached into his coat and produced a document, folded, formal, bearing the seal of a solicitor's office. He held it out to her. She took it. Read it again. It was a deed. For the Voss estate. Transferred, debt cleared, title restored, not to Lord Voss, to Cecily. In her name, outright. She looked up. "It's yours," Edmund said, "regardless of what you decide this morning. It has nothing to do with—" He stopped, pressed on. "I didn't want you to think that one had anything to do with the other." Cecily looked at the document in her hands. She thought about 3 weeks of silence, about a children's table and a silver cup, about a man who chose every word carefully and had apparently spent 3 weeks choosing these. "Edmund," she said, "not your grace, not the Duke, just his name," the first time she had said it aloud, and she watched something in his face change completely at the sound of it. Yes, he said. If I walk out of this house with you this morning, she said, my father will never forgive me. No, he agreed, probably not. There will be a great deal of talk. There will be a great deal of talk regardless, he said. There was talk when I sat at the children's table. I found I didn't particularly mind. She looked at him. Why, she said, you could have anyone. And there it was, the question she had held for weeks, the one she hadn't let herself ask in any of the letters she drafted and discarded and drafted again. Edmund held her gaze. Yes, he said. That's rather the point, Miss Voss. A pause, and then quieter, with the precision of a man who had spent 3 weeks finding the exact words. I have spent a great deal of my life in rooms full of people performing at one another. You sat in a corner at my table and you were entirely, completely yourself. You spoke kindly to a child. You ate your soup. You looked at me when I sat down as though you had absolutely no intention of being impressed. Something moved through his expression. I have been trying, since that evening, to find a single reason why I should want anything else. The entrance hall was very quiet. Lord Voss was still there. He had the look of a man watching something happen that he had caused but could no longer control. Cecily folded the deed, held it, looked at Edmund for a long, final moment. Then she turned to her father. Tell Baron Feltham, she said very calmly, that I am sorry for the inconvenience. She stepped down from the last stair. Edmund offered his arm. She took it. The Ashford dining room seated 40. Cecily knew this better now than she had on the evening she had first walked into it. Knew the way the candlelight fell differently on the east side of the table. Knew which floorboard near the sideboard creaked. Knew that the tall window at the far end, let in a draft in November that the housekeeper managed with a specific folded cloth that was kept in the third drawer of the oak cabinet for exactly this purpose. She was standing at the long table with the seating chart spread before her. It was their first formal dinner as the Duke and Duchess of Ashford. 60 names. 60 small decisions about who sat beside whom, who could not be placed near the window, whose presence 3 seats from whose would require careful management from the soup course onward. She had been at it for an hour. You've moved Viscount Hartley 3 times, said Edmund from the doorway. She didn't look up. He's difficult. He is, Edmund agreed. He came into the room and stood behind her, looking over her shoulder at the chart with the same attentive quiet he brought to everything. Though I'd argue he's less difficult than the alternative you've placed him next to. That's intentional, said Cecily. Edmund looked at the chart, then at her. You're going to make them talk to each other all evening. They've been avoiding a conversation for 2 years. I thought someone should arrange it. A pause. I married a strategist, he said. You married a woman who was seated with children, she said. She paid attention. She felt him smile before she saw it, felt it in the slight shift of the air, the quality of the silence beside her. She made one final adjustment to the chart. At the head of the table, 2 names side by side, the Duke of Ashford, the Duchess of Ashford. She straightened up. Edmund's hand found hers on the table, unhurried, familiar, entirely certain. The hand of a man who had decided, completely and without reservation, and had never once reconsidered. Outside the tall windows the garden was dark. The candles were lit. In an hour the carriages would begin to arrive. The room would fill with exactly the kind of people who had once looked through Cecily Voss as though she were a draft from a window that didn't properly seal. They would look at her differently tonight. She was, she thought, entirely prepared for that. She had been practicing her whole life. She had once been seated below consideration, below her father's care, below the notice of every person in a room full of people who should have known better. Now she decided where everyone sat, and she always left the chair beside her for him. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.